Hello, my name is Scarlett. I'm an Associate Professor in the English Department. My teaching tends to focus on the 19th, 20th and 21st centuries. And my research specialisms are in the writings of James Joyce and the history of critical theory. What I've decided to talk about today, however, is Virginia Woolf, thinking that she is so iconic in culture that she might well serve as a hook by which to allure you into joining us on the BA in English Language and Literature in the autumn. So there she is, and here we go. Virginia Woolf is an author to whom most people come with certain preconceptions. Her name is writ large in English culture. She is, for better or for worse, a cultural icon. The meaning attached to the icon changes from person to person. Some associate her primarily with the Bloomsbury Group and deduce from this that she must have been an eccentric snob. Some think of her first and foremost as a madwoman, or a frigid woman, or a married woman who was also a lesbian, or a woman who committed suicide by filling her pockets and walking down into the River Ouse. Some might have heard of her chiefly in connection with a high modernist stream of consciousness mode of writing, or about To the Lighthouse or Mrs. Dalloway as books you really have to read to understand modernism, literature, life, or loss. Others might associate her with the feminism which produced A Room of One's Own and which led to her intermittent involvement in the suffrage movement. It's difficult, given all this, to know what to focus on in a half-hour lecture. I've decided to begin where life begins, with childhood. With Woolf's childhood in her own words. And here is a picture of her playing cricket with her brother. She was apparently known as the demon bowler in her family. The second letter Woolf is ever known to have written dates from 1888. It's a note to her half-brother, George Duckworth. It's scrawled in big capital letters and it reads, "My dear George, I am a little boy and Adrian is a girl. I have sent you some chocolates. Goodbye, Virginia." It's strange how such simple childish words somehow seem already to sparkle in their whimsicality. To a degree, of course, this is the result of projection. To me, the knowledge that Woolf would spend her whole life enthralled by the power of words to reconfigure how we understand identity make these little sentences, written by a girl just 6 years old, seem staggeringly prescient and emblematic. Considered retrospectively, they read as the seed of a lifetime's exploration into the meaning of words and their relation to personality and specifically to gender. They foreshadow Woolf's intense and tireless inquiries into what it means to be a self, how far it's possible to overcome the boundaries of the self through, for example, imagination, empathy, literature, and what it means to be a man rather than a woman and a woman rather than a man. These themes are at the core of Orlando, a novel she published in 1928 as, amongst other things, a coded love letter to Vita Sackville West, the married woman with whom she had then fallen in love. And on the picture to the right there on the screen, you can see Woolf to the left and Vita Sackville West to the right. Departing from all the modes of writing she'd explored in her earlier novels, Woolf, in this novel, in her own phrase, kicked up her heels. Where her first novel, The Voyage Out, published in 1915, 13 years previously, scrutinises and tests Victorian conceptions of gender in a relatively traditional, realistic and ultimately tragic mode. And whereas Jacob's Room, Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse continued to probe such issues whilst ostensibly focusing on wartime losses, Orlando, reflecting Woolf's personal happiness at the time of its writing, is a jaunt through the centuries from the reign of Elizabeth I to the present day, that is 1928, the year in which it was written and published. It is, in her words, a spoof, a lark, a book written in tearing high spirits. With its subtitle, a biography, the book sets out what lies ahead, the story of a life. It opens with a first sentence which immediately foregrounds the novel's central theme. He, for there could be no doubt of his sex, though the fashion of the time did something to disguise it. This brilliant, typically contradictory opening, in which we're told both that there can be no doubt about Orlando's sex and that his clothes leave the matter open to question, can be seen as one of many, many returns to that childhood letter with which I began. The whole novel, culminating in Orlando's transformation into a woman in chapter 3, at the novel's midpoint, ceaselessly blurs the boundaries between the two genders. And Orlando is not the only character whose gender is, literally, shrouded in doubt. When he falls for the Russian Princess Sasha on a skating rink during the Great Frost of 1608, pictured on the slide now, the same uncertainty, expressed in a strikingly similar phrase, initially prevails. Orlando beheld a figure which, whether boy's or woman's, for the loose tunic and trousers of the Russian fashion served to disguise the sex, filled him with the highest curiosity. Feverish speculation follows as we watch Sasha come into view. When the boy, for alas, a boy it must be, no woman could skate with such speed and vigour, swept almost on tiptoe past him, Orlando was ready to tear his hair with vexation that the person was of his own sex, and thus all embraces were out of the question. But the skater came closer. Legs, hands, carriage were a boy's, but no boy ever had a mouth like that. No boy had those breasts. No boy had eyes which looked as if they had been fished from the bottom of the sea. She was a woman. Phew! That's the implication of this passage, which is narrated from Orlando's point of view. But Orlando's temporary misconception enables Woolf to do three things. Firstly, to have a quick swipe at the ideology of compulsory heterosexuality, the ideology, that is, by which heterosexuality is encouraged by being made to seem inevitable and inescapable. Secondly, to continue her debunking of the notion that gender is in any sense a clear-cut matter. And thirdly, to show what clearly she felt strongly, that you can fall in love with someone before you know what they are, irrespective of their gender. Halfway through the novel, Orlando becomes a woman. Why, how, we don't know. Nor does anyone in the novel ever ask. It just happens. Orlando goes to sleep for a long, long time. And when he wakes, the narrator remarks that we have no choice left but to confess he was a woman. While the new, ravishing Orlando, strong as a man but graceful as a woman, absents herself to take a bath, the narrator profits from the brief interlude to take stock and to engage in some pronominal play with the reader. Orlando had become a woman. There is no denying it. But in every other respect, Orlando remained precisely as he had been. The change of sex, though it altered their future, did nothing whatever to alter their identity. Their faces remained, as their portraits prove, practically the same. His memory, but in future we must, for convention's sake, say her for his and she for he, her memory then went back through all the events of her past life without encountering any obstacle. Orlando feels no surprise at this scarcely creditable change. The memory of her past life, led as a man, does not disrupt her sense of her own identity. Being a woman feels like the most natural thing in the world. This is in keeping with Woolf's conception, in A Room of One's Own, of androgyny as the ideal mental state. In that pamphlet, which was based on a lecture given in the same year as Orlando was published, Woolf wonders whether there are two sexes in the mind corresponding to the two sexes in the body, and whether they also require to be united in order to get complete satisfaction and happiness. Woolf subsequently writes in that essay that she thinks womanly and manly writing is what is most desirable, and this rings in tune with other modernist probing into the psychology of gender. In James Joyce's Ulysses, for example, the protagonist, or one of the protagonists, Leopold Bloom, is hailed as a new womanly man. And in Joyce's earlier novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Stephen Dedalus, who is the protagonist, envisages the artist as one who experiences the phenomena of artistic conception, artistic gestation, and artistic reproduction. So for Stephen Dedalus, as for Virginia Woolf, the artist is an androgynous figure. And it's partly because Tilda Swinton is a brilliant actress, but also because she has particularly androgynous features that she makes such a terrific Orlando in Sally Potter's stunning 1992 adaptation of the novel, which I strongly recommend.
It's really very good. I think it'll sell. By the way, how long did this draft take you?
There can be no doubt about his sex, despite the feminine appearance that every young man of the time aspires to.
Do not fade, Orlando. Do not grow old.
Sasha, I cannot think of a life without you.
I see. You're here as a casualty of love.
To me, you were and always will be, whether male or female. The pink, the pearl, and the perfection of your sex.
Conceive yourself what I was. No difference at all. Here I am again.
Androgyny is also a theme in Woolf's next work, The Waves, which follows its 6 protagonists, Susan, Ginny, Rhoda, Louis, Neville and Bernard, from early childhood into adulthood. The book beautifully interweaves these characters' interior monologues, which are presented as soliloquies. That's to say that they are ostensibly spoken. Each is introduced by clauses which proclaim speech. Said Rhoda, said Neville, said Susan, etc. But the highly poetic prose that follows in every case far outdoes, in stylization and in imaged lyricism, anything that one might either spontaneously speak or spontaneously think, thereby blurring the boundary between the public and the private, and leaving us unclear as to which realm these words are supposed to occupy. These soliloquies constantly highlight the multiplicity of selves which, for Woolf, constitutes the truth of all of us, suggesting that we do not have a single self, a self that is unified at its core, a self fitting that all-purpose pronoun I, but that we are all several, that each of our identities is in fact a constellation of overlapping personalities. Each of these selves feels essential and true while it lasts, and once superseded by another, is revealed to have been merely a role, a temporary acting part. Here is Bernard taking stock of some of the various parts he has played over the course of his life. There are many rooms, many Bernards. There was the charming but weak, the strong but supercilious, the brilliant but remorseless, the very good fellow, but, I make no doubt, the awful bore, the sympathetic but cold, the shabby but, go into the next room, the foppish, the worldly, and too well dressed. What I was to myself was different, was none of these. Likewise, in looking back on a single day, Bernard wonders, which of these people am I? Only to conclude that It depends so much on the room. In the closing pages of the novel, this multiplicity is extended further as Bernard expresses his sense of gender fluidity, but also his sense of a self that may somehow encompass the identities of all the friends, male and female, that we have been following in the novel since infancy. For this is not one life, nor do I always know if I am man or woman, Bernard or Neville, Louis, Susan, Ginny or Rhoda. So strange is the contact of one with another. This is often read by critics as bearing the possible implication that Bernard is in fact the book's narrator, that Neville, Susan, Rhoda, Louis and Ginny are figments of his imagination, that he's been telling a story, making up their stories all along. For like Woolf, Bernard in the novel is a writer. He makes phrases, joining things together, making things connect, shaping the amorphousness of life into some kind of order. In this light, Bernard, like Lily Briscoe, the painter of To the Lighthouse, and Rachel Vinrace, the keen piano player of The Voyage Out, is an artist figure, and as such, a repository for a certain amount of indirect disclosure on Woolf's part. But Bernard, it's important to stress, is not Woolf, nor is Woolf merely Bernard. She is all the others too. While Bernard seems to gather up all his friends into himself, other characters represent quite different conceptions of identity. Rhoda, for instance, who eventually takes her own life, suffers from a sense that her own identity isn't bounded enough, that her boundaries, the bodily limits that should separate her from the world, fail her. Her body isn't strong enough to act as a necessary bulwark or buffer between herself and the world. She feels transparent or invisible, or as though herself were perpetually leaking out into the world, depriving her of a core identity. Month by month, things are losing their hardness. Even my body now lets the light through. My spine is soft like wax near the flame of the candle. I dream, I dream. The danger of dissolution expressed in these sentences, evocative of melting insubstantiality and surreal intangibility, can be related to one of Woolf's own diary entries written in 1917 when her husband Leonard had been away for a few days. One's personality, she wrote, seems to echo out across space when he's not there to enclose all one's vibrations. Rhoda seemingly suffers from the same problem, the odd sense that the line between where she ends and where the world begins is too hazy, too permeable. She is like a snail without a shell. Ginny, by contrast, enjoys living in her body, is at ease in her own skin. Feeling assured of her place in the world, she is happy, grounded. Her sensations, rendered in some of Woolf's most thrillingly vivid images, are intensely visual. I'm out of breath with running, with triumph. My blood must be bright red, whipped up, slapping against my ribs. My soles tingle as if wirings opened and shut in my feet. I see every blade of grass very clear, but the pulse drums so in my forehead, behind my eyes, that everything dances. The net, the grass. Your faces leap like butterflies. The trees seem to jump up and down. There is nothing stayed, nothing settled in this universe. All is rippling, all is dancing, all is quickness and triumph. Now compare this depiction of Ginny's experience to Woolf's own excitement at a party held in Bloomsbury, just 2 streets away from UCL, at 46 Gordon Square in 1923. Suppose one's normal pulse to be 70. In 5 minutes it was 120. And the blood, not the sticky whitish fluid of daytime, but brilliant and prickling like champagne. This was my state and most people's. We collided when we met. Went pop, used Christian names, flattered, praised and thought, or I did, of Shakespeare. We were all easy and gifted and friendly and like good children rewarded by having the capacity for enjoying ourselves thus. For Woolf, the capacity for enjoyment evokes childhood, and this returns us to the theme with which I began. Childhood, often conceived of as a magical time, is an important theme throughout Woolf's writings. As Mrs. Dalloway reflects in the short story entitled Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street, which is a kind of draft from Mrs. Dalloway, there is nothing to take the place of childhood. The Waves follows its characters from childhood onward. The Light to the Lighthouse poignantly brings back to life Woolf's childhood family holidays, and in book after book we see a return to this interest in children and a children's view of life. The Waves relates to Woolf's interest in childhood in another sense too, besides having children at the beginning as the protagonists. The manuscripts of the novel reveal that Woolf's characters, who enter upon an Edenic scene in early childhood, originally appeared as innumerable children rolling off the waves of the sea. In an extraordinary image, Woolf writes of innumerable waves throwing up innumerable multitudes of little bald, naked, purplish balls, twisting babies, pullulating, bubbling. These babies disappear in the final version of the text, but children Woolf did not have because her doctors, after one of her breakdowns, advised Leonard that it would be too dangerous for her fragile mental health for them to have children. Through the years that followed, Woolf's diaries echo with a harrowing sadness about this fact. On the 11th of April 1913, just after the doctors had emitted this advice, she declares to a friend in a syntactical muddle which seems symptomatic of pain and denial that we aren't going to have a baby, but we want to have one, and 6 months in the country or so is said to be necessary first. 5 years later, she asks in a characteristically honest letter to her sister, Vanessa Bell, "Do you ever feel that your entire life is useless, passed in a dream? Or are you always certain that you matter, and matter more than other people? I believe having children must make a lot of difference." Throughout her letters and diaries, one senses a deep longing for the rooting experience of motherhood, and relatedly a massive investment in the creation of books and art as a kind of compensation for the lack of children, a substitute for babies and an alternative means of creation, and also perhaps a route to immortality. In 1926, she jokingly, or perhaps only half-jokingly, teases her sister Vanessa, whose paintings were doing very well at the time, stating with half-feigned jealousy that, as you have the children, the fame, by rights, belongs to me. In a particularly striking comment inscribed in her diary just before she embarked upon the composition of Bernard's closing soliloquy in The Waves, Woolf reflects that, "I had a day of intoxication when I said, 'Children are nothing to this,' when I sat surveying the whole book complete and felt the pressure of the form, the splendour and the greatness, as perhaps I had never felt them." There is yet another sense in which Woolf's work seems shaped by childhood, and it is this. If one reads Woolf's works, one cannot help but be struck by the constancy of certain themes and images. The whole corpus of her works appears as one vast echo chamber in which the same themes and tropes recur again and again. Themes such as love, loss, death, drowning, the inadequacy of words to human experience, and motifs such as those of waves breaking and rooks cawing. In 1939, Woolf wrote an autobiographical essay detailing her very earliest childhood memories. Small wonder, reading them, idyllic as they are, that she should have spent her life trying to reconjure the kind of paradisal perfection of those early years, when her family stood complete, when death had wrought none of the devastations which were to follow. For death struck with cruel regularity in Woolf's early life. To name just a few of these disasters, her mother died in 1895, causing Woolf, then aged only 13, to suffer the first of many serious breakdowns and setting the pattern really for a life of distress. Her sister Stella died in 1897, just 2 years later, and 3 months after she, that is Stella, had got married. Her father then died in 1904, 7 years later, causing another major breakdown. And her brother Toby, her favourite brother, I think, died in 1906 in his mid-20s of typhoid fever, which he had contracted whilst they were holidaying together in Greece with others. So a kind of chronology of catastrophe, really. But it's not just that Woolf tries to recapture the wholeness of what she experienced before all of this, when she was a child. That makes me say that Sketch of the Past, which is the name of this late essay I'm talking about, seems to me to illuminate everything that she wrote afterwards. The essay gives a transfixing account of her first memory, presented as the foundation of everything that would follow. If life, she writes, has a base that it stands upon, if it is a bowl that one fills and fills and fills, then my bowl, without a doubt, stands on this first memory. It is of lying half asleep, half awake. It is of hearing the waves breaking, 1, 2, 1, 2, and sending a splash of water over the beach, and then breaking 1, 2, 1, 2 behind a yellow blind. It is a feeling the purest ecstasy I can conceive. On the next page, Woolf muses that if I were a painter, I should make a picture that was globular, semi-transparent. I should make curved shapes showing the light through, but not giving a clear outline. What was seen would at the same time be heard. I also hear the caw of rooks falling from a great height. Such ecstasy as I cannot describe. Waves, rooks, ecstasy, these appear in every one of Woolf's works. But here is also inscribed her interest in synesthesia, the simultaneous flooding of several senses, and her interest, crucially, in how literature and other arts might approximate this experience. If I was a painter, that quotation begins. In the Bloomsbury years, Woolf was surrounded by painters, her sister foremost among them. Vanessa Bell, Clive Bell, Duncan Grant, Roger Fry, all experimented with an English strand of post-impressionism, a mode of painting which was a reaction against the naturalism of the Impressionists and which explored the emotional response of the artist to a subject rather than the general observer's view or impression. And here are two examples of Vanessa Bell's painting in this post-impressionist mode, Virginia on the left and Leonard on the right. Woolf, in her own medium, sought to explore emotional response, to focalise her narrative through her character's eyes, as we saw earlier with those passages capturing Rhoda, Bernard, Ginny's point of view, rather than to adopt an external, omniscient point of view. I'd like to draw your attention to two other elements of Woolf's early memory. Firstly, the counting. Remember that Woolf hears the waves breaking, 1, 2, 1, 2, and then breaking again, 1, 2, 1, 2. This ties into Woolf's interest in music. As I mentioned earlier, her first heroine, Rachel Vinrace, in The Voyage Out, is a talented and passionate pianist. But music here, in this first memory, is stripped of melody, pared down to a beat, an oscillation. It seems to me to adumbrate Woolf's obsession with rhythm. Rhythm as perceived in the events of the world, in the repeated breaking of waves, for example, and rhythm in literature as a verbal approximation of that perceptual experience. This is expressed in Woolf's later sense, expressed in a letter of 1926 to Vita Sackville-West, that style is a very simple matter. It is all rhythm. Once you get that, you can't use the wrong words. Now, this is very profound, what rhythm is, and goes far deeper than words. A sight, an emotion, creates this wave in the mind long before it makes words fit to it. And in writing, such is my present belief, one has to recapture this and set this working, which has apparently nothing apparently to do with words. And then, as it breaks and rumbles in the mind, it makes words fit to it. Bernard, in The Waves, shares this rhythmical conception of rhythm. Now I'm getting the hang of it, he says. Now I am getting Byron's beat into my brain. The rhythm is the main thing in writing. Now, without pausing, I will begin on the very lilt of the stroke. This idea is a core element of Woolf's genius. Her understanding of the pleasure generated by certain patterns of repetition is what drives her to sculpt individual phrases, sentences, paragraphs, pages, and entire books into formal structures, what endows her prose with the qualities of poetry. So much in Woolf seems to abide by this principle of rhythmical alternation. Even her treatment of ideas seems to fit into this scheme. Mr. Dalloway, Woolf explores one thing and then its opposite. This is what is written of Mrs. Dalloway at the beginning of the novel of that title. She would not say of anyone in the world now that they were this or that. She felt very young, at the same time unspeakably aged. She sliced like a knife through everything, at the same time was outside, looking on. This rhythmical principle applied to theme explains Woolf's constant return to, for instance, the binary of gender, 1, 2, 1, 2, the obsession with life and death, 1, 2, and with multiple selves, 1, 2. Her partiality for weaving in and out of different characters' minds through free, indirect discourse. They went in and out of each other's minds without any effort, thinks Peter Walsh in Mrs. Dalloway, reflecting Woolf's own practice throughout the book. The combination in Woolf's works of stylistic and conceptual rhythms seems to be one of the ways in which Woolf endows the inner lives of her characters with such lyrical vividness and memorability, creating epiphanies and psychological transparencies whose rhythmical beat lives on in the mind long after the books have been put down. There is, of course, much more to be said about Woolf and about her interest in rhythm, but do rest assured that the rest of the course, were you to choose and come and join us, offers you many opportunities from the first year through the second and the third to revisit this author and indeed many or any of her modernist contemporaries. And so with that, I will leave you and wish you all the best and hope perhaps to meet you in the autumn.